I'm Ann Rieselbach, the Architecture League's Program Director, and I'm happy to welcome you to the first of the League's 2021 FF's Distance Edition programs, a digital rework of our monthly studio-based First Friday programs. We're continuing to take the opportunity to visit practices who expand disciplinary boundaries by taking on multiple roles. Upcoming programs include next month's presentation by Winnipeg-based 5468696 Architecture, which will also be at 6 p.m. I notice on the slide loop it was showing as noon, and future studio visits in Boston, Mexico City, and LA. Tonight's event with SITU Studio will be introduced by and moderated by Killian Riano. Killian is the founder and lead designer of Design Agency, a design studio exploring new forms of political engagement and co-creation through architecture, urbanism, landscapes, and art. He's also the associate director of Kent State University's Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, where he provides strategy and design coordination for their urban design, applied research, engagement, publication, and academic activities. Killian is also an editorial contributor to the Architecture League's newly launched American Roundtable Initiative you saw listed in the slideshow just before this talk. Following SITU's presentation and Killian's discussion with some of the collaborative firm members, the discussion will be open to all attendees, and please pose your questions in the chat section. And we also hope at that point you'll all turn on your cameras so we can make this more of a community event where we can see each other like the real First Fridays in studios that we did, the real-time ones. And that I think is probably enough for now. So Killian.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the conversation. I'm very excited to be here. Thanks so much, Anne, for the invitation, and Brad, who invited me from SITU. It's going to be my pleasure to talk about and give a brief introduction to this conversation because SITU is a group that I've always enjoyed looking at the work, seeing it in different capacities, and I'll share with that a little bit. And to think through, because their model is so different and interesting, the many things that they do, about the possibility of practice in the American context, in the US context, about how both to take on more than what architectural practice sometimes takes on, while staying grounded in the principles of architecture and design. So this is all to say that I'm very excited to be here. It's also particularly nice to be here on a day in which the work of SITU and SITU's research wing for Human Rights Watch was used as part of the decision by the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James, to sue the New York Police Department for excessive use of force. That shows a commitment to both larger conversations and issues that are civically going on and impact. We will talk more about all that later, but I am sure that in a moment in which conspiracy theories and fake narratives seem to be taking over all over social media, it's great to see the role that the designers and the tools that we have as designers have in making a case for the truth, in finding truth from the many kind of conflicting narratives that we confront every day. A bit about how we're going to run the show, as Anne just mentioned. I'm hoping that this little introduction and a quick conversation after is going to put some issues on the table to talk about what SITU themselves call themselves an unconventional practice way of working. And that is for good reason, because they are really three interrelated but different units that even could be thought of as different practices in themselves. I even was wondering what word to begin to use. It's obviously one group, but is it? I ended up using an amalgamation of interest and ways of working. Then the representatives of SITU are going to present the studio, the fabrications areas, and as well as the research and the impact that the research has been having. And then I'll have the little conversation. Then we'll open it up for conversation with everyone. We'll try to be quick so that that conversation can be fruitful. Again, there's probably a lot both in the content of what SITU is and what they do, but as well as the systems, the techniques by which they make this three-pronged way of working work, how to, and it's going to be interesting. So, I mean, three things that I wanted to talk about as we start. I wanted to be, you know, one of the things that I'm going to be looking forward to chatting is about that amalgamated model and how does it work? When does it all come together into one project? And when is it better for one group just to take on something and deep dive? And I'm curious, you know, what time, at what points, being able to, for the research to have the fabrication and be able to have some conversations, when is that helpful? And when do tensions arise? I think that we're all interested in those sets of conversations, as well as you know, the sharing of specific administrative staffs and all that kind of thing, the realities of running a practice and how having a central location might help each one of the units quite a bit. I'm also interested in the skills of operation and the learning of technique, the learning of the practice at each one of those skills. I mean, SITU works at research, the research section works at a large scale. It can, you know, by the nature of the work that they do, looking at the realities of real conditions, such as the New York Police Department's response to the protest this summer in the Bronx. That's an urban undertaking. Then the practice, which works on multiple skills, but interestingly, often at a very civic skill. I've been, you know, I love the project in the Science Museum in Queens with the pods. I've always enjoyed the one at the Brooklyn Public Library when I worked for the city of New York. That was a project that we were always looking at often as something very innovative that was being done within our civic units. And as well as then the fabrication that gets down to the details and how to make some of those big things happening. So I'm really curious about those sets of skilled questions. And again, those fabrication, I would ever go to the research section with a question, and are there potentials for those skills to move back and forth? And then finally, I think that it's important and interesting that SITU in all its wings tries to be part of larger civic conversations. Again, the research has had a lot of impact already, finding human rights abuses to work crimes, things that are large scale and that often, I would say almost never, architects are really involved, and finding ways to use the tools to expand what our toolkit can do and who it can serve. And I think that's incredibly important right now. And the studio section really seeing the impact that I have seen in civic buildings all over the city of New York, and always being part of a larger conversation, and as well as the fabrication, trying to think about its role within public space. So I think that the three things that I would like to come back to, and that I hope that you know, through the presentation, some things are going to come, is that model, how does it work, the skills and techniques, and then finally how to have practices that are active participants in larger conversations. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the SITU folks. Each one of them is going to introduce themselves. And then when they're done, we'll begin a conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Killian. And thanks everybody for joining. I'm sure the last thing people want to do is spend more time on a screen right now. So we're particularly grateful that you're coming out. Thank you also to the Architectural League for hosting. Yeah, and thanks to Killian. You know, big admirer of both his work as a designer, but also as a thinker, and excited to be in conversation tonight around our work. Can we throw up the presentation? Is that possible? There we go. Okay, cool. Okay, so you can go to the first slide. Next. Okay, so we are SITU. We describe ourselves next as an unconventional architecture practice that uses design, research, and fabrication for creative and social impact. Next. The Architectural League asked us tonight to really kind of touch on the totality of the practice, and the kind of ethos at SITU is really the sum is greater than the parts. You know, we have 3 divisions: studio, fabrication, and research. And you know, the kind of ideal scenario is that we're working on projects that touch all 3. And sometimes that's the case, and sometimes we're working on things where it's just one of those divisions. And we're gonna show projects that kind of fit into both categories tonight. Next. But in the kind of broadest of strokes, studio is our design division, and we work at a range of scales, everything from, you know, community rooms for the Brooklyn Public Library to master plans for mixed use, transit-oriented development, and kind of everything in between. Next. Our fabrication division focuses on technically challenging projects, projects that really kind of meld digital to physical workflows. And ultimately, it's about getting things built with fidelity. Next. And the research division, which, you know, is really at the perimeters of what we typically think about as architecture. It tends to be, all the work we do in research tends to be highly interdisciplinary. And I think it begs some pretty fundamental questions about what is architecture? Are we doing that? Is it something else at this point? And I'll come back to that and show some examples. Next. If we could all be together now, we'd be in the Navy Yards, where we have 2 facilities. Our fabrication division is in building 132, which is the red building there. And our design and research divisions are in building 77, which is about 5 minutes walk. And, you know, as we all know, different types of work during the pandemic is done different ways. And some work has to be done in person and some work can be done remotely. And fabrication certainly continues to be done on premises, on site. And I want to just acknowledge that our fabrication team has been working on site, on premises throughout over the past months, and our research and studio team has been a bit more of a diaspora. But we look forward to the time when we can be working together in the same spot and have meetings like this together. So the kind of general run of show is we're going to spend a little bit of time, about maybe five minutes talking about studio, another 5 minutes talking about fabrication, some recent fabrication work, and then a little bit more time talking about some of our research work, given current events in New York and across the country. It feels timely to focus a bit more on that. But we're really kind of relying on Killian to help us find the through lines here. I think it'll feel schizophrenic in some ways because the work is so varied. But you know, our team at SITU is really interdisciplinary. We have, of course, we have architects and planners, but we have computer scientists that work with us, and people with furniture design backgrounds and literature backgrounds. And so it's a highly interdisciplinary team, and really there's a lot of linkage between the 3 divisions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Katie Shima, our Director of Design, to talk about some of the studio work. Next.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for being here. Yeah, like Brad said, I'm going to just share a few a few projects briefly, kind of focusing on what we've been doing this year, and I guess hoping to show how the pandemic has kind of helped us focus our practice more on social impact, which is something that we've always strived for. Next. So over the summer, we had the opportunity to help Brooklyn Lab Charter School to reopen. In-person instruction is a core part of their mission. A lot of their students come from disadvantaged economic situations. A lot of them are what they call complex learners. They require a little bit more individualized lesson plans. And in-person education really ensures that all their students receive an equitable education. So they needed a way to help kids, get in the building safely, have health screenings prior to entering the building, and create a safe entry zone as they orchestrate these 1,000 students trying to get in this one building, which is a mixed-use building. So together with WXY and UPC, we developed this front porch that reimagines the building's entry experience, really extending the building, the lobby into the public realm. Next. This created a space for social distancing, health checks, school breakfast and lunch distribution, and also a range of other activities that can now take place outside. Prior to school reopening, we also did a demonstration run with the school staff to get them comfortable with the new protocols and to get their feedback on the process. And that prototyping was really important to get everybody on board and comfortable. Next. Overall, the system has been pretty successful. It enabled them to identify symptomatic students and staff prior to them entering the building, which was great. And moreover, in the midst of a really tough year, it made students and staff feel safe and confident that the administration was really taking their health seriously, and got the students even excited about coming back to school. Next. One more project from the summer that I want to share is as New York City was beginning to ramp up its testing capacity over the summer, we worked in collaboration with local testing organizations, hospitals, and government agencies to develop a walk-up screening booth, kind of the equivalent of the drive-through screening booths that you have in more suburban cities for COVID testing. The booth provides better protection for healthcare workers on the inside of the booth. Next. And is lightweight and quickly deployable. So it's adaptable to a number of different site conditions, which enables testing agencies to reach the areas of the city where testing is most needed. Next. Something that we're currently in the very early stages of that I wanted to share is we're working with local arts organizations, legislators, and public agencies to enable more outdoor cultural programming. Even before in the coming months, during the pandemic. As you know, the arts have been hit particularly hard by the pandemic, and as the arts are an important driver of economic activity and as well as social and mental well-being, it's critical that arts organizations find a way to revitalize in the coming months. Recently, the city passed the Open Culture Bill, which eases some of the permitting restrictions for outdoor arts programming. And we've developed this kit of parts for mobile pop-up or temporary theaters for a handful of pilot sites to help get this initiative off the ground. Longer term, we also think that this has the potential to bring more cultural opportunities to underserved communities and also to broaden the range of artistic voices across the city. Next. And I just want to end on a project that has been a kind of ongoing project for many years now with the Brooklyn Public Library. It actually started as a research project that our research division was involved in, where they were investigating the vast array of programming that library branches host. Next. From cooking classes to job training, it's really an astonishing array of programs that these libraries were never initially designed to hold. So we started looking at how better to equip these libraries to respond to their community's needs. Next. We developed a kit of parts to outfit existing community rooms so that the public can reconfigure these spaces with minimal staff involvement for whatever activity they might want to have. This reconfigurability enables these spaces to evolve over time to respond to future community needs. Next, and really empowers the end users to make these spaces their own. We also worked with our fabrication division to prototype and build the initial round of components in our shop. And we've also begun to work with other fabrication partners to get these things built at scale. Next. Overall, we've had really positive feedback. The first branch we outfitted was the Flatbush branch, and we've since expanded it to 4 additional branches. And I also wanted to end with this project because it's a good example of how all 3 divisions can be involved in a single project and use their different areas of expertise at different stages. And with that, I will hand it over to Andrew, who will talk about what's going on in our fabrication division.
Hey folks, I'm Andrew. I'm our business development manager for our fabrication division. Next. Right now, I'm speaking to you from the floor of our shop space here in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We're located at building 132. It's the entire building, so you can catch a glimpse behind me of some of the equipment that we're using, from our large scale CNC router to our thermoformer. And so we have a lot at our disposal here. We're really blending the use of those digital equipment with really hands-on techniques that are done by our staff. We're about 20 people. Next. And our team is split into project managers and fabrication specialists. So people working upstairs in an office that we have, and then down on the shop floor with hands-on building. And like Brad mentioned, we are using this space to prototype for our own projects. We're also, a large part of what we do here is working with other architects and designers. So we really frequently partner with architects, interior designers, artists, contractors, and we help develop the details for their projects, as well as fabricate and install those. Next. Yeah, so we're working on, actually, sorry, back up just 1 second. So we're working on a range of projects, from different cultural spaces. We're working with Andreas Steele, for example, on the L10 Arts and Cultural Center, which is in Fort Greene. We're doing some curved shelving for them. We're also partnering to produce an art installation with Adam Pendleton for MoMA, which is an upcoming exhibition. There's, a public parks project at the Battery with BKSK, where we're building up this kind of standalone children's theater space for them. And that kind of speaks to these public projects that we're really excited to take on next, which includes this project at Little Island, where we're really, excited to take on something that's this unique and this kind of public space. A lot of you are probably familiar with the project. It's designed by Heatherwick Studio and Matthews Nielsen Landscape Architects. And it's got a lot of character as this kind of unique waterfront park. It's set to open in the spring. And to kind of complement the organic forms and unique character of this, the client brought us on to fabricate, design and fabricate seating amenities like throughout the park. Next. So that includes primarily this large amphitheater space. It's a 700 person amphitheater with kind of stadium style seating around that. There's another scope area, which is the southern stage, and that's a little bit smaller but monolithic kind of shared seating. And then a series of trail benches that are scattered throughout the site, along kind of trails that weave throughout the park. Next. And first, kind of with the southern stage area, this is a glimpse of the design. There's this kind of monolithic approach. We're using 8x8 timbers of black locust. That it's a material that we're using it to kind of connect all of these different areas. The facing of those benches has a really unique sculpturality to it. Next. And you can see a little bit more detail of that here. Next. but it's got a commonality in the approach and the technique that we're using with the trail benches, which are also sculpted out of larger timbers. Next. And that process starts with, building up a large massing. We're actually using a chainsaw to cut down a rougher shape out of that. Next. We're using the grinders to kind of get a finer detail, and then ultimately hand finishing that. Next. So you can see that's one of the final pieces. There's quite a different technique used for the amphitheater area. Next. And this is a more slatted approach. So out of all of these 700 seats, we're actually doing about 70 of these kind of custom designs, so that it's not just one type of seat repeated. There's different parts that are curved. There's different parts that seat one person versus up to 5 people. Next. And to make this, you can see a curved section here. We're using a couple of different techniques, all with black locust, laminating different members of the kind of slatted profile. Next. And you can see how those are different sections really. So in the red section, we're bending it along the kind of exposed show face. On the blue section, we're steam bending that along the edge face. And on the cyan portions, we're bending it and also CNC milling it. So I'll show you just an image, and then we'll jump to some part of the shop floor where I can demonstrate that. Next. So on the left here, you see our CNC router. This is flip milling, a doubly, you're flipping over the piece to get this really unique kind of geometry, doubly curved geometry to the surface. You also have the steam building image on the right side, steam bending image on the right side, and that's the pressurized chamber that we're using to really work with a flexible wood. So I'm going to switch the camera. My colleague's going to quickly follow me over to another area here. But like I mentioned, this is a project that we're really excited to have in production right now. We're actually producing this for the spring, so we're really well underway. We're using another space nearby to kind of store some of the pieces, but you can see in this assembly area a lot of like what our team is up to build the amphitheater components. So this is the steam building kind of setup that we have. We have a larger pressurized chamber that warms up a larger quantity of the wood. And that's used to kind of make it a little bit more pliable before it goes into the actual final chamber where it's heated really pretty hot so that it's really flexible. Those are going into a series of jigs here. And what we're doing there is just gluing them, laminating them, clamping that up. And you're left with these curved ribs essentially. And to turn that into the bench, we're really, for most of those pieces, we're going to just round off the edges by hand, but there's definitely quite a few components which need to be milled out on a 5-axis CNC, so you can see a little bit more of that unique profile here. And it's really great for us to be able to work with hand techniques, with experimental practices, with digital equipment, and really combining all of those to find a best solution or kind of an integrated solution for whatever that design is. But I'm gonna leave it there and pass it over to Brad, who is gonna speak more about our research division.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I feel like there's no easy way to make this transition except to say, and now for something completely different. So our research division functions in 2 ways. Next slide. In some sense, it functions like many other practices. Our research supports our design work in the sense that it could be programmatic analysis or post-occupancy analysis, but sort of research in support of design work, architectural work. Next. But what's a little unusual, can you just let me know if it's too staticky? I was getting a little static here. What's a little unusual is that our work, another part of our research work, most of our research work is grant funded and focused really squarely on human rights. Next. And our clients are, again, quite different than the clients we have for studio and fabrication. Could be advocacy organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, or legal contexts. We do work for the International Criminal Court and the United Nations. And all of it is really focused on, the project of merging data and design to find new pathways for justice and accountability, and mobilizing our tools as an interdisciplinary practice to do that. And I'm going to provide a few examples. But before I do, I do want to just kind of like mention at the beginning, I'm not going to show anything terribly graphic, but we work on human rights violations. And so the content is some of it's violent. And I know that we've all been inundated with a lot of violent content lately. So I just want to give everyone a heads up to kind of be aware and take care. Next slide. A lot of the work we've been doing, not exclusively, but a lot of the work we've been doing over the past 5 years or so is focused on public assembly, the right to assemble, suppression of dissent, and police violence, basically. What you're looking at is a photograph of the Maidan in 2014 in Ukraine, where there were massive protests. And we were working on, next slide. Hopefully this will show up. We were working on a project to reconstruct a series of interactions between police and protesters during the Euromaidan events. It doesn't look like it's showing up. That's okay. You can go to the next slide. Other projects we worked on recently is a case in Iraq. Again, massive protests that we were looking at and interactions between protesters and police in relation to the built environment. And that's really kind of where we're fitting in here is these protests are happening in cities, often, almost always. So it's really about the relationship between the urban environment, the city, and the right to assemble. Next. Sometimes we're looking at sort of massive groups of people. Other times we're looking at the use of certain weapons. So here we were working with Amnesty International to analyze the misuse of tear gas against protesters in Venezuela. In this case, a police officer firing a tear gas canister directly at a protester, which you'll see hits the shield. They're never supposed to be fired directly at people. Tear gas is supposed to be shot high up in the air, and it's supposed to deploy gas. But when you fire them directly at people, you can severely injure or kill them. And as we're working on this stuff over the past few years, the work has been everywhere but the United States, right? And so the irony is not lost on us that in May and June, following the murder of George Floyd and the sort of massive amounts of protests that we were seeing across the country, next slide, as part of the Black Lives Matter movement, it was important for us to really make a hard pivot and to reapply these same methods and tools that have been focused in Nicaragua and in Ukraine and Iraq, and refocus them on our own country and on our own cities. And part of what we really tooled up to do is to do this quickly, because this is not about one event in one city. This is about systemic violence, geographically distributed, and there's no shortage of it. Next. So this is just an example. The protests there were people were protesting violence, but there were also the protests were met with violence and met with excessive use of force. And this is an example of tear gas being deployed against protesters in Philadelphia that were trapped on the side of an embankment and had nowhere to go. This is not how tear gas is supposed to be used. But in order to really understand why, you have to analyze the space of this situation, this embankment on the side of a highway. Next. And one of the the kind of common themes in all the work that we're doing. Matt, can you lower it a little bit? Lower the volume to cap, or just turn it off. That's fine. Is the proliferation of video. All of these events are documented with so much video that it's impossible to even comb through it, right? But this is all evidence. This is all documenting these protests, documenting these events, and become evidentiary material if something were to happen, if it's excessive use of force, or if there's a police tactic that's deployed, or a so-called less lethal weapon that's misused. So this digging through video, making sense of video is critical to almost every project we do. Next. And really it's about combining the video or the kind of optical documentation of these events with the models of the urban environment, right? And so here, this is an experiment with ways of combining video footage with the digital model. That was in Charlotte, North Carolina, where we're looking at a case right now. Next. So I'm going to talk about two cases, and I have to apologize in advance. I think we're going to go a little bit past time here. But the first case on the left is in New York City, involves the NYPD, and the second case is in Portland involving the Portland Police Bureau. The NYPD case is really an advocacy case, so we work a lot with advocacy outcomes, but we're also working a lot on litigation, and we're working a lot with in legal forms. They're related, but in fact quite different in terms of how we approach the work. Next. So the case, the NYPD case, this is June 4th in Mott Haven in the Bronx. This is a protest that was organized by the FTP4 coalition, protesting violence against Black lives. And it was a peaceful protest. This is where people assembled at the beginning of the protest at around 7 p.m. And following this, next slide. The protesters marched south down towards 136th Street and Brook Avenue, again, peacefully. And this is critical to understanding and analyzing what came next. Next. So this is at the intersection of Brook and 136th Street. And just for context, as a reminder, June 4th, I think is the second day, maybe the third day of the curfew that de Blasio had instituted. So there was an 8 p.m. curfew. And what you see here are police kettling. It's a term which is often referred to as kettling, sometimes referred to as encirclement, basically trapping protesters, blocking them on all sides, and in this case, committing many acts of violence and ultimately arresting a lot of them. And what's also important to note here is that the tactic in this case was initiated before the curfew. So basically you had protesters coming down 136th Street. The police got into position and began to trap the protesters before 8 p.m. And then when 8 p.m. hit, they started arresting people. And it got out of control, and there was a lot of violence, and there were injuries, and there was a lot of arrests. Next slide. And so just a word about how we got involved. On the left is a report that was put out by Human Rights Watch. So Human Rights Watch, which most of you probably are somewhat familiar with, was doing a long form written analysis of the protests, of that event on June 4th in the Bronx. They had a lot of video evidence, hundreds and hundreds of videos, and they were not used to working with visual and video content. And so they reached out to us to ask them if we could help them with a kind of visual investigation, a visual analysis that really builds upon the video to sort of render visible the police tactics, to clarify the sequence of events. So that's how we got involved. Next. One of the first things we're often doing is placing those videos in space. And so here you can see cones of view, which are related to the positions of the videos, the positions from which the videos were shot, and the digital model, right? You were using some of the New York City open data to build this model. So it's about understanding where the videos were taken from. Next. But also really importantly, when the videos were taken. And so you have videos from multiple vantage points, but you also have videos that are capturing the same moment in time, the same event from different angles. And that becomes really valuable to kind of, again, try and get a coherent and clear understanding of a pretty complex event. So here what you're looking at is the audio of the videos, and we're lining up the videos based on the audio signature because the metadata is not always reliable. Next slide. And one of the first things we did was to just map out the protesters' route. I mentioned that they met at the hub and then walked south, again, peacefully through the Patterson houses down to a restaurant called La Morada, which was feeding a lot of the protesters during the protests in New York City. And I'm going to the end product, the end thing that we produced with Human Rights Watch was a video, an advocacy video, which I'm going to just play about a minute of now. Next.
As the marchers headed down,
Can you make it louder?
police officers blocked the street.
Yo, we gonna go around. We want to go around.
The march redirected down 136th Street. And in the final minutes, just before the 8 o'clock curfew, instead of allowing or even directing the marchers to disperse, the NYPD diverted its bicycle officers to block the marchers just as they reached the intersection of 136th and Brook Avenue. And from behind the march, a line of officers blocked the protesters from turning back. It's a tactic called kettling.
Next slide. So this is an example of where the video footage really becomes helpful. It's shot from very high above. You can really get a clear picture of the tactic here. Very hard to understand on the ground from video footage that was on the ground. But also I think what's critically important here is the relationship between the tactic and the architecture, or the tactic and the space. So police are creating a barrier at the front and back and using the kind of urban environment as a kind of as the sides, right? And there's no place to go. And this is it's extremely dangerous. It's dangerous even when it's executed skillfully, let alone when it's not. Next slide. One of the things that we saw was that the tactic was pre-planned, but a lot of the violence that erupted in the kind of, in this case, the beating of protesters with batons from the tops of cars, I don't think was planned. It was just sort of out of control very quickly. Next slide. There were over 260 people arrested. There's a mass arrest. They were sent to and booked in all 5 boroughs. And among those arrested were legal observers, which is not lawful. You're not allowed to arrest legal observers. Ultimately, no one was charged with crimes. And so it really begs the question, why was this necessary? And certainly, why were the injuries and the level of violence necessary in this case? Next slide. So part of this work is, the question is like, why are we doing this? To what end? This work was submitted with a Human Rights Watch's report, which called for accountability from the mayor, accountability from Shea, who's the chief of police, and Monahan, who is the lead officer on the site. And I think it was somewhat successful in keeping the pressure up on de Blasio to answer for this. After this event on June 4th, he came out in public statements saying that the police acted appropriately, that the plan was executed, perfectly, and that also that protesters were violent, which is patently untrue, and that's what we sought to demonstrate really clearly. In the months that followed, there was a New York City Department of Investigation report that was released finally after about 6 months, at the beginning of December, and it was a very damning report. It came to the conclusion that the NYPD used excessive force, that they hadn't planned properly, and that there was really no structure for accountability. And the mayor responded the morning that it came out. Next slide.
I'm reflecting on what happened in May and June, and I look back with remorse. I wish I had done better. I want everyone to understand that. And I'm sorry I didn't do better, and I've learned a lot of valuable lessons, and I want our police department to do better. And I'm going to insist upon that. I don't want to ever see some of these situations happen again, and they don't have to happen again in New York.
This came, in my opinion, way too late. This is after 6 months of supporting the tactics and getting behind what NYPD had done. Next slide. And I just want to mention today, this is just this afternoon, the New York Attorney General Letitia James announced that there's going to be a lawsuit against the city of New York, specifically on NYPD conduct during after the George Floyd protests. And so, our work was one piece of many projects that pointed to this, but the kind of, this is what we were hoping for, some kind of accountability. I wouldn't say that we're there yet, but today this development is moving in the right direction. Next slide. And I'm going to show one more project just because it's a little bit different. So that was a project that's really an advocacy project. What I'm going to show you now is a project it's a legal context. We were working in Portland for a case. The client was Don't Shoot Portland. That's an advocacy organization. And they were seeking sanctions against the use of force, different types of less lethal munitions, and conduct by the Portland Police Bureau. So we're working with a team of attorneys representing a group called Don't Shoot Portland. Next slide. And what's different here from what I just showed you was the kettling was like really the main thing in the last case. This is a series of incidents that happened over the course of one night that we had to really identify over a period of time, in a very granular way, given the legal form in which it was going to be presented. So a number of incidents, and these are uses of force. And the question really for the lawyers and the judge was, what happened in the moments leading up to the use of force? Because that ultimately matters when you're trying to determine whether the use of force was justified or not, whether it was excessive. So this is one of the diagrams we made in the very beginning to just map out in time and space a series of events on one evening during protests in Portland. Next slide. Another thing that's a bit different from the case I just showed you was that we had really good 3D data for this case. We worked with a surveyor who was able to get a photogrammetrics model from flying a drone over in a grid, and combine that with laser scans on the ground. So the photogrammetric scan from the photogrammetric model from the drone was very good at getting a large geographic extent, but then we had a really specific area of interest where he was able to get the vertical surfaces on the street and combine those data sets. And just managing the data was a whole task in and of itself. Next. I don't know, Matt, if you can lower the volume. Anyway, this is get a sense of relationship between the video and the digital model here. It's a really high fidelity digital model, and we're calling out specific incidents here, the preventing of dispersal. On the one hand, they're saying move east, on the other hand, they're not letting them move east. There's cases where they're firing impact munitions at people, hitting them with batons, and it gets even down to like individual frames within 1 second of footage. So it's very granular, very specific, but it's the nature of what needed to be done in court, right, in a legal context. Next slide. And then just one of the other things that we were looking at was, you know, not all of the violence was coming from one direction, just coming from the police. There were protesters who were throwing things at police, water bottles and things like that. And one of the questions was, when the police use force against, say someone throws a water bottle, but the police use force against another individual, is that justified? Is that use of force justified? So here you're seeing that they deployed a flashbang grenade, and we're putting into the digital model. We're showing that the person was complying and moving back in space, and that this particular person did nothing to justify that use of force. Next slide. And in this case, also, you know, we're happy to report that this actually, to everyone's surprise, not even the lawyers thought this was going to happen. The judge held the Portland Police Bureau in contempt over their conduct that evening. The reconstruction we just showed you was used in court. The lawyers walked through it, the defense and the prosecution questioned it. But I think it hopefully was helpful. It seems to have been helpful in providing a very specific focus and a clear and coherent reconstruction of the events in question. And just yesterday, the judge also issued a series of directives limiting what kind of tools police are able to use in future protests, you know, to police future protests. Next slide. And I just felt like I needed to end with this. It's been a very intense week for all of us. And there is one thing that shows up a lot in this work, and it is it's the question of competing narratives, right? It's the question of, you know, complex events, many narratives about what happened, who was responsible, why, in what order, and the complexity and the fact that there's many narratives often becomes a cover for those who are not interested in accountability, right? The line is often, it's too complicated, it's too complex, we'll never know what happened, right? And our goal in this work is to try and cut through the noise and establish a baseline understanding of events, even if we can't know everything. And I think that that's going to be that approach. It's being done by many people right now. There's lots of people looking at the events of the last 2 weeks, but it's about kind of like cutting through the noise and establishing what we can know, and not letting this kind of narrative of chaos and complexity, which frankly the Trump administration thrives in, to preclude accountability. So it's a rather heavy note to end on, but with that, I think I'm gonna turn it back over to Killian. Go to the next slide. Killian, back to you.
Brad, and it's, you know, in your presentation, it's so interesting to start with Ukraine and finish with our capital. That really tells this a story of political upheaval in the last 8 years or so that is kind of incredible to think about, and bendings of truths and narratives at will. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Katie and Andrew. It's fascinating to get a peek inside of a practice that does so much. And I think that, you know, we could go dive deeper into any of the projects, etc. But I think that I would like to begin the conversation a little bit about high level, because I think probably a lot of folks here, a lot of the 100+ people that are here, along with myself, we're curious about how you make a practice like this work. What is it like? And I think that, you know, Brad, you talked a little bit that some of the research that you do feeds into some of the projects that happen in the studio, but that some of them you go out and search for it. But I'm curious. For example, does a project come in and all three, you know, the three wings come together and talk about it? I'm also curious if you ever share what kind of infrastructure you share to make this work, and if employees go back and forth. You know, for example, looking at the system that Andrew showed us, which is kind of fascinating, and I'm not 100% sure if that's a custom built system or something you buy, but I was thinking about the person that would have the skills to put the black locust in there, and the person that could have the skills to then do the kind of analyses that the research group does. And so if you wouldn't mind, just let's begin there. What kind of infrastructure exists to support you? And then how much conversation happens among these kind of different projects? Is it just when a project comes in that seems interesting for all three groups to discuss, that happens, or is there a larger strategy?
Sure. Maybe I'll start, and Katie and Andrew, please jump in at any point. You know, there is a kind of the three divisions, and then there's the kind of administrative core of our organization that supports all three. And in some ways, you know, the research division is the smallest. You know, quite literally, actually, we've got 4 people, but we rely heavily, specifically in moments when we're like inundated with work, on the other parts of the practice to come in and support, either with expertise or with analytical support. So for example, when there was just so many videos to go through during the early days of the protests, we assembled the whole team, you know, or a self-selecting group of like people who were interested in fabrication and studio and research to just look at protest footage and try and help us organize it. And so that allowed us to kind of punch above our weight, so to speak. You know, as a small research division, we became a bigger group of people for a moment. And at the same time, there are moments, you know, we have expertise in research, which is computational. And there are times when that level of expertise can be brought to bear in fabrication, or at least can be in conversation with some of the more technical questions in fabrication. I don't want to sort of paint the picture that it happens all the time, because it doesn't. But there are moments when there's certainly overlap, and a lot of things that happen off projects around process and methodology that I think just create for a very rich conversation within SITU. I don't know if Katie or Andrew, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I guess just to give another example, with the Brooklyn Public Library project that I mentioned, you know, in the beginning, it seemed like it was going to be more of a research project, more kind of data analysis. But then as we got further into it, it seemed like, you know, architectural visualization and kind of thinking about program and thinking about kind of the infrastructure required to create that program or support that program, then the studio needed to get involved for that part of it. And then in the next iteration, as we began to develop it further, and the need to prototype became clear, then we brought in fabrication as well. So it's I think it depends a lot on the type of project, and kind of the complexity and kind of what that project involves. But yeah, sometimes it evolves over time like that.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think in terms of culture within SITU, that's really like a commonality. There's kind of this infrastructure of curiosity for different scope areas, for different ways of seeing the world. I think, you know, a lot of our fabricators on the floor have like lots of really interesting ideas that cross between the different divisions. And that, I think, is a really strong piece of kind of infrastructure that's not maybe like a practice per se, but it's just really a culture that kind of unifies the way we operate as a whole.
Maybe just one other thing I'll say, because I think it's actually germane. There was a moment in early June, I think it was, maybe it was late May, when we were trying to just figure out how to function as a company in the middle of COVID, and had our heads down, thinking about very practical things and talking about very practical things. And it was really our mostly our fabrication staff that was out in the street protesting and you know, encouraging us to get our priorities straight and to refocus our efforts on what really mattered. So I didn't see that. I didn't, you know, it wasn't the research division that was doing that. It was the fabrication division that was telling us, you know, we should be reapplying. We should be thinking more about this. We should be talking about this stuff as an organization and doing something about it.
So interesting. And I wonder if you would mind sharing a little bit, and again, maybe specifically for the fabrication and the research section, but also for the studio, if there are specific skills that you look for when you look for people to join your team. That's already been asked in the conversation. And we can talk about it, but I'm very curious about that. I'm very curious about, are you finding the people with the skills for that when people come to you, what are you looking for?
You know, within the, you know, we talk about the commonalities. I think this is an important point to emphasize the skills that are different as well. You know, like a master welder has got a different set of skills than somebody with a computer science background. And so we're often, you know, looking very specific skill sets. And, but at the same time, people that really, I think, enjoy working at SITU and thrive at SITU are ones that have, you know, a lot of curiosity across the range of things that we do. And there's a lot of surprises. People come in and work for one thing, start working on one thing, and they end up, you know, migrating and floating over and spending the next 2 years working on a totally different practice. But I think it is, you know, we talk about the interdisciplinary nature of what we do and the kind of umbrella of SITU, but within that umbrella, there's a lot of very specialized skills that are interesting and somewhat rarefied to kind of find at times. I don't know if Katie or Andrew, you want to say anything about that?
No, I think that covers it. I mean, especially in fabrication, there's very specific, finite skills in certain areas, and that's, you know, project dependent. For when there's a project that needs more finishing work versus metal work versus work with cast resin, for example, there are definitely concrete skills there that we need to leverage. But I think, you know, if there are times when we don't have that in-house, we are also, you know, being in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, we're working collaboratively with lots of other different teams, whether those are kind of peers within fabrication or whether those are other designers. And I think that's a big part of what we do is also leveraging like a collaborative approach to kind of fit any gaps that we might have.
Katie, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo a lot of what's been said already. I think, you know, there's some skills that are specific to architecture that we need to hire for. I don't think those would be surprising to people in the audience today. But also, as Brad said, we do have a number of people who, you know, for example, if there's a project that starts as a design project that it turns out we are well suited to fabricate, that person, you know, may actually be working on the project, prototyping it, working on the shop floor. I think above all, communication is probably really important, just because we, you know, when that happens, it's important to keep everybody in the loop and to leverage all the different expertise that we have in the studio. Communication is really important to make that happen.
Great. I have one more quick question. Something that I'm curious again about your practice, both given the history and kind of places that I have, some of the things that I have seen, and then we're gonna go into a question. There's already a couple of great ones being asked, one that already kind of brought up around these skills. But I'm also curious about tensions and conflict. I think that, for example, I would imagine many firms and many places, even academic organizations with a more advocacy unit or firms with research centers, tend to shy away sometimes from the more from that advocacy out of fear that they're gonna lose jobs, etc., or that some of that is gonna create tension within the firm. And similarly, and you know, sometimes in our field there's false dichotomies that kind of arise, that if you are good at fabrication, you should stick to that lane, otherwise you're gonna confuse the message, etc. I find it fascinating and even kind of very refreshing that standing up for that. This is what an architectural design practice does. It's all of it. You can't do and making almost an argument for all of it. But I do wonder what tensions and conflicts. And conflict here, I don't mean in a bad term, because conflicts can be actually very good for any system. It brings up questions. It brings up issues and forces to take some positions. But I am curious about if those ever arise and how, for example, if you go for a fabrication job, do they ask you about the research and like, what are they doing, or something like that? And I'm just speculating.
Andrew, Katie, you want to take that first? Take the easy one.
Brad, I'll let you shoot first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when you work as we do, building complex things driven by the real estate industry in New York, it doesn't take very long before you hit really unsavory and problematic sources of money and clients and projects. And you know, that's more of the conflict that is constantly sort of being discussed at SITU right now, is how to discuss those things and you know, be discerning, and where to draw those lines is, you know, you start to scratch the surface, and of course it's everywhere, right? So it's not that we're timid about doing work that's quite out there in terms of, you know, human rights or civil society or protesting police violence, but you know, we have a kind of split in our work between the work that is our creative output and work that is realizing other people's vision. And I think there are moments where that creates tension in terms of what's being produced and the money that's going into building it. And you know, we turn down work. We've turned down work from the Saudi government, from places like Facebook, but like, how do we make those decisions? Where do we draw those lines? That's constantly a conversation within the practice and something we're continuing to talk about. Do we alienate people with our social impact work? I don't know. I don't, you know, it hasn't been a problem, and I guess I should say I don't really care as long as we can run our business as we are. So I don't know, Andrew or Katie, if you got anything to add.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's pretty evident, like the question in fabrication division, where we're building things and there's already developed design in mind, often where we're working with other teams. And there's some pretty obvious challenges to that, like Brad was mentioning, but I don't think that this is unique to our firm or to a fabrication firm. This really touches all designers, where, you know, it's an industry where we are so tied into capitalism. We are really struggling to grapple with systemic issues on a societal level, but also on an industry level. And, you know, we're not removed from that. And I think that's something that we all are facing. And I think it's something that, you know, the work that we do that is more explicitly geared towards social justice or towards a social impact allows us to be more mindful of that as we, you know, keep on with the daily work in other divisions or just, you know, across the board. So it's especially this year propelling our team to have those conversations in a really productive way. And I think we're all pretty excited to see like how that transforms and how we can think creatively about business model in addition to thinking creatively about the project at hand.
Yeah, and Katie, or we can.
Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. I don't know if I have much to add there.
So I thank you for your honesty in on those conversations, and I'm gonna welcome everyone to turn on their video to make it more of a kind of community conversation. I know that a few folks have already begun to ask questions. Spike Wolf asked a question around teams and synergies dynamics, and I think I feel like we went over that. I would like to invite maybe Paul Lewis. Is it okay if I invite, or should I say the question? Say the question? Okay. So Paul Lewis asks, or says, fantastic. In your fabrication work, one of your expertise is translating between the precision of computational models and the messiness of the reality of materials, joints, movements, flaws. On the other hand, your human rights research works the other way, to translate the messiness of footage into super precise, omnipotent architectural models to produce evidence towards an argument about truth. How much is this oscillation acknowledged at SITU? And do you have anxiety about or illusions of precision?
This is a really good question. And I love the end of that question in particular. Part of one thing we've been trying to do recently is put in very simple words, very complex stuff we try and do in research in particular. And we kept coming back to the word truth, right? You know, we're in pursuit of truth. And I continue to be uncomfortable with that word. It just wasn't sitting right. You know, we're trying to surface facts, perhaps, but the question of truth is a slippery one, and the illusion of precision around something we can't agree upon right now as a country, I think is a fool's errand. So, you know, what I can say is that we try and equip ourselves with an array of tools, right? I would say we're not a technocratic practice. We're not technology driven. But if we feel like we have the broadest array of tools and the people that can really be comfortable deploying them, using them, breaking them, rebuilding them, that I think sets us up well to get into the messiness, right? And to try and surface what's important, surface the facts, if not the truth, and not to sort of not to fall into the fallacy of the illusion of truth. I mean, one thing that's also interesting, I'll say, is that, you know, in the legal context, when you present this work in the research context, it's very visually compelling. It's very seductive. And I think that in and of itself, the seduction of the work visually is liability, because it then gets questioned, you know, why is it so slick, right? So I think these are all kind of questions which feed into each other. And certainly precision plays out a bit differently in fabrication. I don't know if Andrew or Katie and design, if you want to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I can a little bit. I mean, I think, you know, precision, it's a kind of interesting concept. I'd say that as a studio, I'd say that we're not particularly precious about our work. We care deeply about details, but I think we try to design with the messiness of the world in mind. Like, we try to, you know, be practical, and we always kind of, I'd say we keep one step ahead, you know, thinking about how it's going to be built, how it's going to come together, what are the tolerances, what can we expect, and are there better ways to build it? I think that's always kind of in the back of our minds when we design something. So yes, we put lots of thought and care into designing details and designing precise details, but we do that because we know that that the world is messy. So we try to kind of design around it to make sure that we can get the exact effect we want, despite everything else that's going on.
Thank you so much. Emily Bao has a question, and I'm inviting her to ask it.
Hi, thank you guys so much for the presentation. I'm wondering about the genesis for the research sort of side of the studio, whether that was more of an organic outgrowth of a particular project or whether that was there from the beginning, and also how much of the work that comes to the research studio is sort of self-initiated and done potentially at risk versus having a client kind of in mind from the beginning.
Yeah, the genesis of the research work going all the way back, I think, was just out of a frustration of in school, like being interested in social and geopolitical questions, but not really ever being satisfied with architecture, the agency of the architect practiced in the way that I was seeing it done, as a way to address social and political questions. And so it was really about, can we, instead of designing something and putting it into the world and engaging these questions that way, it was really about taking the tools, the methods, the education, and reapplying it as a kind of analytical frame or lens. And it was speculative, right? The speculation in the beginning was, can this help human rights organizations? Can it help civil society? In the early days, that was a conversation where we would go to Human Rights Watch and say, like, this is what we can do. And they'd be really interested, but kind of have quizzical looks on their faces. And, it was sort of an awkward conversation. But then, of course, 3 weeks later, we get a phone call. Oh, I have this project. I think it might be a good fit. Let's talk about it. And then, so that was the kind of early days. But, in the past year, and I think we've seen an explosion of this type of work sort of broadly. If you look at the visual investigations division at the New York Times or the Washington Post or forensic architecture or Bellingcat, this idea that, things that were traditionally done textually are now, in terms of investigative work, there's a visual component which is either happening in parallel or happening instead, right? And so now we're just getting a lot of requests to do a lot of things, more than we can handle. So I would say the conversation shifted over time.
Thank you. There's a couple of comments also, but I don't see really questions. Thank you so much, Galen, for your comment, and of course, Rosalie. I'm wondering if there are any other questions, though. We have a few more minutes, and it would be great if maybe one or two more questions, if for anyone. Feel free to either unmute and ask, or to put it here and in the chat, and I can ask it for you. But are there any other? Galen?
Hi there. So just fantastic. I just really want to thank you for sharing that. It really resonated with me, and I can tell in the way in which you're speaking about it, how passionate you all are about what you do. And certainly, Brad, to the emotion when you were playing the videos and sort of watching it sort of, took me back, and still at this present moment in time. So yeah, I'm glad we're all grappling with this, and so I'm glad you are sort of also up to the charge and are doing the work that you're doing. So thank you for that. But I am wondering, as an alum from our Cooper, and the studio relationships, and I think a lot of the bonds that are formed in studio, and the camaraderie of how we sort of, what I miss about it, and as we're all sort of working, most of us are still working remotely, sort of walking up to each other's desk and saying, hey, what you working on? and, you know, how do you respond to each other in that way? I think you kind of get caught up in the day-to-day of, you know, producing and, you know, making and building, which is wonderful, but how do we still sort of, do we have the time out to also, you know, how should I say it? You know, just have that sort of very informal critique, so to speak. And do you still have that? And just share a little bit about the inner workings of the three teams and everybody working. And you touched on it a bit, but I just thought I could hear a little more from you all on that informal camaraderie at SITU.
Katie or Andrew, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, myself, I'm normally working remotely these days, and it's really challenging personally to, you know, stay as connected with the kind of interesting projects and really important details of the projects that are going on on the shop floor. You know, my area is a little bit outside of the production, but I think, you know, for our teams on the shop floor and in this space, it's you know, not really much more camaraderie, I think, than almost us working from home, because there are strict, you know, measures that we have in place to keep people safe. So I think for everyone, we are still just feeling pretty alien about it, and trying to find experimental ways to introduce informal moments, but it's not, obviously, not the same, I think. Katie or Brad, I don't know if you have other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I spend a lot of time on Google Hangouts and on Slack, for better, for worse. I mean, I think in some respects, you know, the use of Slack and kind of the use of other online ways to connect with people has increased, and I think in some respects has actually been good. And also, some of our studio staff have been to the office here and there just to, you know, to work with material samples. I was there myself earlier today. But yeah, I do. To be totally honest, I do miss that part of the process. There's something that's a little bit missing still.
And you know, I do wonder, as a kind of follow up, and it might be the last question unless there's something else, is about COVID and how COVID has both shifted your practices. You talked about a little bit, but you know, I think some folks are, and obviously nothing has ended, things are still happening, but some people are beginning to wonder what of this of this current moment is gonna change the way that we work. I mean, obviously, for example, in the work that Katie began to show or was showing, there's even a new imagination about the public realm, extensions of buildings, like literally kind of beginning. So I'm curious about what the current moment has taught is how is shifting some of the work and ways of working of SITU.
Well, I think before COVID, you know, there were themes of modularity, flexibility, reconfigurability, you know, things that are quickly deployed, which we were already interested in, and those are just like on steroids right now, because so much is changing so quickly, and unexpected things are happening all the time, and I don't know that it's a sustainable approach, you know, way to move through the world as a design firm, but it has really tested us. It's been a stress test for some of those ideas. And I think there will be enduring experiments that will kind of stick around after, you know, after everyone's vaccinated and whatever the new normal is going to be. But you know, some of the things I hope may endure, like the Open Culture Project, where it's about like bringing culture to public spaces. You know, it'd be great if that model distributes performances and culture in places that don't get it as much, right? if that kind of distributed model touches more areas, if public libraries that are serving so dependent on right now for meeting basic needs across the board are given more resources, but it's recognized that how important they are to communities, underserved communities. So there are things that I think will endure. I also think just kind of operationally within SITU, it's forced a lot of very difficult conversations on a whole range of things within our organization, and brought us, ironically, I'd say in some ways closer together, even though we're all, all over the place, and sort of in conversation about things that are on people's minds, but whether it's safety or whether it's race or whether it's equity, those are things that we are squarely focused on now as an organization, and it's somehow been part of this experience.
Yeah, I guess building on that a little bit, I think going forward, I hope that we will be a little bit more intentional about how we operate as an organization, and kind of across the board. I think we're seeing that in workplaces and cultural spaces as well. And I think I at least have been trying a lot more actively to kind of check in with my team in an intentional way, just because I don't see them, every day. To make time to actually check in person, and to be much more intentional with understanding what everybody's needs are. I think that's been something that's really important, during the pandemic, and that will hopefully last. And that, when we do come out of this, that we can all be more intentional with how we use our collaborative time, how we use our in-person time together, because we know how valuable it is.
Yeah, and I think taking just a little different perspective, thinking about in the early kind of weeks and months of COVID, how we were really pivoting towards kind of emergency work. And we saw that a lot with other fabricators, other makers, other architects and designers, really try to pivot to address how we can work together to provide critically needed supplies. And that kind of mindset was a pretty interesting shift to feel like you're working in parallel with people that didn't really have to be a project per se, or didn't have to be as transactional perhaps. And I'm interested to see, and I think, out of all of those conversations, like how can we maintain systems of kind of mutual resources for one another, and that the idea of being a resource across teams has been something that I think was a really positive part of what came out of our response to the pandemic. And it'll be interesting to see how that can continue, or if it does or does not.
With that, I want to thank you so much. Thank you again for the invitation to be in conversation with you. And thanks so much, Anne and Rosalie and the League.
And I'm going to jump in and thank the members of the SITU team who took part in this program: Brad, Katie, Andrew, and Invisible Matt, who's been controlling the slideshows and things, and to all of you for coming. And a reminder for those of you looking for CEUs, if you send your AIA registration number to rsvp@archleague.org, this was good for one CEU. We look forward to seeing you next month on February 4th. We're going to Winnipeg. I think rumor has it part of the time we might even be skating on the river. The firm is 546-8796. And in addition to that, as I'd mentioned, and Killian took part in last night, we also have a whole series called American Roundtable with lunchtime programs that are filling a lot of the weeks of January and February. So please visit the website if you don't do it frequently. Sign up for our listserv if you're not on it already. And we hope to see you at this and other League events. So thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
And of course, thanks to Killian for just a fantastic job leading the conversation.
Yes. Thank you, Killian.